Okay, I guess that was just the sound of the recording starting. All right. So continuing then today with questions of identity. And so you'll recall last time, I think maybe we got a little bit bogged down, by the fact that the people whose identities we were thinking about were Nazis. But please, remember the kind of the broader thinking. And you can take it, as you were kind of taking the notion of addiction with a grain of salt. Whether you're persuaded by that argument or not. But again, recall, I think more kind of broadly accepted would be these notions that that identity has a sort of a deep cognitive track, and that it can be something that's really difficult to shed, to consciously try to be somebody different than who you are, is difficult, because it is so deeply ingrained in your psyche. The way that you do things, things that you have been taught since you were a child, are difficult. We can even see this, these are, sort of general notions of socialization, of human development, whatever, going at least back to George Herbert Mead's work, which I know a few of you are familiar with. What was I going to say? Just this idea that, things you are taught in your early socialization are really hard to shed. You may not, I don't know if you've noticed this yet, just how much you are like your parents in a lot of senses. How you may use expressions or tell jokes or things that they tell, or you may, one stupid thing you may realize, when you cohabit with somebody, is that there are different ways to organize the silverware drawer. Do you know what I'm talking about? If you could turn your mics on and just say yes or no. I can't.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. All right. So silverware drawer, right? You may think now that there is one right way, the only way to organize the silverware drawer, and that might not be especially important to your identity, but when you move in with somebody and they want to organize the silverware drawer in a different way, you will find that you're just doing things based on the way that your parents did them and that you were taught to do, and that there's none of this, of course, is natural. And one last thing, started to allude to it at the end of class last time, didn't really dive in too deep though, is that this becomes a bodily issue. This is what Bourdieu calls the habitus. And so things like the way that you carry yourself when you walk, the way that your voice sounds, the way that you react, either, and this kind of bears on the hot and cold emotion thing too, the way you react to a speaker, your sort of facial expressions. Those are characteristic of different identities, and it's quite difficult to shed them, right? So, especially something like losing an accent. I mean, that is physically, in your mouth, in the different physical organs that you use to form sounds, and that's very difficult to unlearn. But you may know people who are doing that. If you have a thick Chicago or a thick Boston or a thick Southern accent, frequently if and when you go to college, you work to shed that accent. You work to sort of reorder your sound production to mitigate, in a sense, that former identity. And now today, we're looking at this all in terms of gender and sexuality. And I think, with both of these readings, we do get to a much more sort of nuanced sense of identity than was in Griswold. She's more focused on collective identities. These are more focused on, how the individual performs identities themselves, and the difficulties that presents not only for them, but for people who are receiving those identities, perceiving those identities, right? So also, so we'll think about that as Jake will get going in his presentation in a second here. Also, something to sort of think about with all this that I don't think we've really looked at too hard yet, except for maybe with the Parvez article on the burqa, how people deploy cultural objects. So we're thinking in a sense of identity as a whole, as a cultural object. Would also like you to think about how people deploy cultural objects, particular cultural objects, in the construction or the performance of their identity, right? So, for Parvez's informants in France, remember that was, whether or not you wear the burqa, is important to your identity as a particular kind of Muslim, and I think we'll probably see, or at least be able to think about a little bit of that today. How do men perform masculinity by using certain objects? How do women perform femininity by using certain objects? And how are those things really potentially not of the body, right, but of the gendered performance per se? So unless there are questions or issues, I'm gonna let Jake take over now. Are you ready to do that, Jake?
Yeah. I've never done the present on this before, so
Okay.
bear with me for a
Sure.
second. Hopefully, you guys can see it.
Yep. Looks like it's working.
Do you see? Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And okay, can you see that just fine, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
Cool. All right. So with this reading, to start off, it's about gender normals and transgender people and societal maintenance of heterosexuality, because heterosexuality is so dominant in our society. And this is by Kristen Schilt and Laurel Westbrook. And at the beginning, just to go over a few things, there's two case studies in this. One is about the ethnographic study of trans males, which is the transition from female to male, in the workplace, and then the media narratives about killing trans women because there's been so many issues with that, especially fairly recently, and that's male to female trans women, and it also examines how gender normals or non-trans people interact with transgender people to highlight the connections between doing gender and heteronormativity. Um, and then another good thing to know is gender and sexuality are tied together. Um, Sexual and sexualized relationships are gendered. Um, Men and women select targets for and utilize gendered tactics to police natural gender boundaries and repair breaches to heteronormativity. And the last kind of note there was kind of, I didn't really understand it all the way, so I was wondering if you could talk about it briefly, Professor.
Got to turn my mic back on there. Sorry. Um, well, I mean, we'll kind of see it probably as you get into the article, right? But so the gendered tactics are things. Well, I mean, the most extreme case is the use of violence against trans women. So, and what the argument that Westbrook is making at that point is essentially that violence is a male gendered activity. And so when men feel threatened or tricked by trans women, that is the most masculine tactic that they have in their repertoire. And on a sort of a more mundane level, it's the kind of ball busting behavior that guys engage with, that men engage with trans males in the workplace, and that sort of that funny stuff that women in the workplace do with trans men, of like having them like lift heavy objects and stuff. Like, okay, we're going to reinforce these gender boundaries that we've established. And so if you're going to say you're a man, we're going to make you do all these like maximally masculine things. Does that make some more sense?
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Okay.
And then going from there, to just kind of getting more into detail with the introduction, um, feminism, Marxism, method, and the state. Sexuality is kind of the linchpin of gender inequality, and that's according to Catherine McKinnon. And heterosexual women on the margins and heterosexual men are in the center. So there's kind of like a spectrum to this, is what I've kind of gathered what um, they they were trying to say in the article. And this allows the theorization of heteronormativity. And an example would be, there are two and only two genders, because I'm sure you've heard that before. And the heterosexuality plays a central role in maintaining gender hierarchy, that subordinates women to men. And heterosexuality and gender oppression remain under-theorized. I'm not sure exactly why it's under-theorized, but that's a good question to ask. Transgender people are people who live their lives in a social gender that's not their gender that they were assigned at birth. And if you've met a transgender person before, I'm sure you've heard about that in specific. The social situation of cultural genitalia is that drive from their gender presentation. And then there's the relationship between the maintenance of gender and then the maintenance of heterosexuality. So basically, gender, there's maintenance to gender. Um, and you kind of have to keep all that balanced. And then there's how, and I have a question for the group that was in the article. I figured that would be good for our discussion as well. And it's how do cisgender men and women react to transgender people?
Well, oftentimes it was really violent, because I think I read that they felt like tricked. I guess that's when they were sexually hooking up also, though. There were like instances in the workplace where they were, trying to accept them, like the patting on the back example that we read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of times they react negatively, whether that's in public or in like private. Obviously that's not like all people, and like times are changing. But just like through the article and through like friends that I have that are transgender, hearing their stories, it definitely shows how negatively cisgender people react to them. And especially in like sexual situations, like a lot of people will like just like leave the situation when they like find out that the person that they were engaging in is transgender, and it's really, really awful. And it makes me so angry.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. And I'll get back to this sort of question at the end with the discussion question, kind of go back to it a little bit for myself. And is there any more questions or concerns? Okay. Then I'll move on to gender order. And our current gender order is the patterns of power relations between men and women that shape norms or femininity and masculinity by defining what is gender appropriate and romantic partner selection, occupational choice, and parental roles. And then the gender order is hierarchical, which means higher value on masculinity than femininity. And we kind of talked about that a little bit as male with violence, and I kind of connects with the two from what I'm gathering. Masculinity and femininity are not fixed properties, and masculinity pushes men to do dominance, while femininity pushes women to do submission. And that's kind of always been that way since we've known. And heterosexual expectations are embedded in social institutions. And masculinity privileges heterosexuality, so they kind of go hand in hand. Transgender people can successfully do masculinity or femininity without having the genitalia that are presumed to follow. And then going from there, about the 2 case studies, of course, I'll just go over it once again. It's the ethnographic study of trans males in the workplace and the media narratives about killing trans women. In the first case, the result of it was the reactions in the workplace had few demographic differences between transmit from the 2 regions. And the second case, the mainstream media provided reflections of dominant explanations of why such violence may occur and provides useful insight into the sex, gender, sexuality system. And going from there, I have 2 discussion questions for you guys. And so the first question is, how does this reading connect with your life experiences meeting a transgender person? Like, what kind of things from the reading connect the reading to this question, kind of, is what I'm getting at.
I have a friend whose family, like, this is kind of similar to when they say, like, if they say they want to be something, they kind of try to force them in harder ways to be that way. And so I have a friend whose family doesn't accept him being a trans male. So, like, they'll still call him her and, like, do all of these things, but they'll try to make him do a bunch of manly stuff. I don't really know how to explain it, but, like,
Yeah, no, I get that 100% because I myself have had an experience with as my own father decided to transition into a female when I was little, and my parents got a divorce because of that. But from what I've gotten through all of this, and I was like really little when this happened, so I was like 8 years old, so I had no clue what was going on whatsoever. But this kind of makes more sense, and like with masculinity and femininity, all of this talk with the reading, kind of like connecting it with that helped me.
I think it's interesting too, like as Barry mentioned earlier, you know, things have changed a bit over time. So I think certainly, you know, while it's still not, you know, clearly an easy transition, it's less difficult than it was. I think you hear less stories, you know, like they mentioned Brandon Tina, who was a trans man who was murdered in the 90s. I think you hear less of those stories now, but you know, at least for me in my own experience of with trans people, they're doing so, in institutions like Eckerd or other universities where things are relatively accepting. People are relatively accepting. I could imagine, though, that in whatever West Texas and these kind of places, it must be much more difficult, right?
Oh yeah, most definitely, and that's actually where I was living at the time when my father were transitioned, was actually in Texas, and he continued to live in Texas. So I imagine that was really hard, living in Texas, because especially rural Texas, like there's a lot of just a lot of phobias in general, like transgender phobias, homosexuality phobias,
Right.
kind
Well,
of.
and really strict religious policing and all that.
Yeah, most definitely.
I think it's like the internalized not homophobia, the internalized transphobia in this country is absolutely unbelievable, because even people who are like, oh no, like I support transgender individuals, like blah 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 blah, like if they, like a lot of them won't engage romantically with transgender individuals, and it's really, really frustrating, because people who claim to be like supportive of transgender individuals, they have internalized transphobia and like won't admit it. And then it's also interesting because there's so much transphobia in the LGBTQ community, and it's unbelievable. I just
Oh
wanted to
yeah,
throw
most definitely. Okay, and if we are done with that question, and there's no more comments, the next question: will heterosexuality and masculinity dominance begin to fade as society progresses? Do
No.
do you think that could possibly happen, or
No, I don't think
no?
so. We would need a complete restructure of society as it is, in order to like take out the patriarchal design of it, and just the fact that like we would have to change society completely, because there's so much like institutionalized like patriarchal aspects, and like heteronormativity and masculinity basically reigns supreme in everything. And I think that the only way to be able to do that would be to like completely restructure society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm
I
also,
agree.
like, if we
Okay, I
structure
see where you're coming from. Is there any other anybody else want to respond to this question?
I guess I'm curious if you mean like masculinity dominance, like within like the transgender community, because, or like and like their violence towards transgender community, or just masculinity in general.
I think just masculinity in general.
So I don't think masculinity in general will begin to fade anytime soon. But I think that maybe there could be like progress within like the transgender community, like if we make it more of like an open like conversation,
Yeah.
people aren't scared to talk about it. I think that maybe like violence within that can go down, like you don't
Yeah,
have
I
to,
feel like that's a major problem right now, is just talking about it.
yeah, like you don't have to be scared of transgender people, like they're just people, and if you're not comfortable with it, you can talk to them instead of like killing them, like god damn.
Yeah.
Conversation surrounding that, maybe it can begin to fade, but that's just me thinking out loud.
And if there's no more comments, then that is all I have for today.
Okay.
I think I've gone through everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. Yeah, and you certainly bring up a interesting, difficult question there, right? So the notion of progress, and certainly Schilt and Westbrook don't seem too optimistic themselves with respect to this material. Although, again, I mean, like you said, Sophia, I think the extremes of this are the murders of trans people, the violence against trans people. Certainly, it's not gone away, but it has attenuated somewhat since the time that they were writing. There's a few things that are kind of so you did a good job, Jay, kind of covering what the article's about. There are these things, though, these kind of theoretical dimensions that they just kind of slip in here and there that you wouldn't necessarily catch along the way, but that I think are pretty important, for us in general to have a sense of. And the first thing, well, I mean, I guess it's just again to reiterate that point that you made about like gender being in institutions, right? So like institutions are organized around gender, clearly, maybe most clearly, and I think this is kind of where McKinnon was coming from to some extent, like the institution of marriage. Even after Obergefell, even with same-sex marriage, especially in the religious sense of marriage, and I don't know how many weddings you go to, right? You've got to be at that point where you're starting to go to lots of your friends' weddings. If your friends get married in like one of the more evangelical church, what are you shaking your head at, Joelle? Your friends aren't getting married?
I'm 21. Do people get married at 21?
People get married at 18 sometimes, yeah.
I know a few people that have gotten married in college. My roommate freshman year is now married. I didn't even get invited to the wedding, but it's fine.
Yeah.
My friend just got married, but she's older than me, so she's like 23, 24.
Right, that's the thing. Is it's those 22, 23, 24 where I think it really starts to pick up. But when you go to especially like I was saying, the religious weddings and especially the evangelical weddings, like they really strictly make clear like this is the man's role, or like man is the head of woman. Right? And it's like, whoa, okay, that like puts a pretty fine point on things, right? So, and then so it's in institutions, but also it is in the way that people behave. Clearly, and this is really the sociological point about gender, right? Is that gender is not something that you have, but gender is something you do, right? So the doing gender thing, and that's like with these workplace issues of lift the heavy boxes, and but they mentioned killing spiders, kill the spiders. That's a thing that men do. But what? Oh, the issue of framing that's in here, and this is really kind of only they allude to it briefly towards the introduction of the article, I think, and then they kind of bring it back a little bit with the newspaper stuff. But this is really it's funny here. Because normally when we talk about framing, we're talking about where did I put the good pen? We're talking about Sorry, I'm just going to change my view so I can see what you can see. Okay. Normally when we talk about framing, we're talking about how, again, social movements frame things. So you remember last time I was talking about pro-choice versus pro-life. Framing, though, especially as they're using it in this article, is just it's a general activity, cultural activity that we all engage in, and especially that the media engage in. A nice way that I've seen it, it's not totally authentic to how Goffman originated the term, but a nice way that I've seen it discussed is to think about it sort of literally like a picture frame. And when you frame a picture, you know, and I don't know. So some of your parents are divorced. You know, I don't know if your moms or dads went around doing this at some point, but like they'll like take old like family pictures, or like they'll have a picture that they like of themselves and their ex, and they'll like literally cut the ex out of the picture and get a smaller picture frame, because that's what they want you to focus on, right? So now no longer the X doesn't count any longer. Don't pay no attention to that part. Only pay attention to the stuff inside the picture frame. And I think that's a pretty solid metaphor for how people use framing as a thought process, right? As helping them to understand phenomena that go on in the world. The issue, the question and this is more, I guess, Schilt's part of the paper. The issue that Schilt is really dealing with is that there are any variety of frames that we could apply to any given situation. We say like, oh, this is part of this kind of stuff, but not, you know, any other kind of stuff. And the framing issue that she focused on is so it's trans killing and you know, specifically it's always the killing of trans women by heterosexual men. It's looking at trans killing as deception. She doesn't really present alternative frames to that, but you know, you could think of it as, I mean, you could look at it as just as any other killing. Or if you were writing a newspaper article, you'll often see, you know, they make appeals to the moms of the murder victims to sort of say like, you know, oh, he was a good boy or she was a good person, that sort of thing. That's not where they go with the killing of trans people. Where they go with this is that, well, I mean, I guess it's not as deception, but as, I guess, revenge for deception. Which is a particular way of framing the performance of the trans identity. This is saying that that genitals are the real reality of gender, and that somebody who is performing as a woman but has male genitalia or lacks female genitalia is a deceiver. And therefore, to understand the killings of these people, they've already sort of baked in a defense for the killers. The killer can say, like, I was deceived and I was taking revenge for that deception. This also then leads to, so again, I think this is just a generally important concept for you to bear in mind as you're thinking about culture, is that we like to lump things in to different categories or these different frames to help us understand things, and clearly that's a frame that helps people understand trans killings, and I think it extends to trans people in general, right? So the trans people in general are being regarded as deceivers in some sense. This also goes to and there's some more argument about this. We like to think in binaries. We like to think in binaries, which means that everything is either this or that, but there's no in-between categories. And so she makes reference to the one drop rule. This is the rule in American culture traditionally, and this still more or less persists, that if you have any African lineage, then you are African American. You're either white or you're African American. Obviously, there are now other ethnicities that problematize that somewhat, but still, I think with any ethnicity, really, if there's any bit of African American lineage in there, then you're lumped in as African American, and people make assumptions about the kind of person that you should be. And with respect to gender and sex, you can be either, right, there are two things that you're supposed to be. You're either supposed to be a heterosexual man or a heterosexual woman. And anything that violates that throws you into the other category. And again, this goes back to that point that Jake mentioned, that a heterosexual man is the sort of ideal category, or the most valorized, or the most important category. So what she's saying here is, well, I guess maybe it's not quite to heterosexual women, but I'm not even sure how to put it. The idea being that if you engage in sexual relations with anybody but for a heterosexual man, if you engage in sexual relations with anybody but a heterosexual woman who was born with female genitalia, then you're not a proper heterosexual man anymore. And I think that is, an important thing to think about, to understand about gender relations in general, right? That there's this notion of pollution there, that one can't be what you are, or you can't have a particular kind of identity unless you follow that straight and narrow all the time. And I think that's probably true of different identities, right? So you could think about what's the right way to be an American, or what's the right way to be a college student. And you may feel, I think you probably do at certain times, we talk about the imposter syndrome. I think this is a factor that plays into that. It's like, well, if I didn't submit to ASA for 2 years in a row, can I really call myself a sociologist anymore? If you don't follow the cultural scripts that are set up for you, do you really count as that thing that you want to be, right? Because we tend to think in these purely binary categories. Is that pretty clear? Makes sense? Okay, cool. And what? Collective identity as interactive accomplishment. Now, I think we kind of covered that. I think this is, similar to what I was just saying. So this is kind of getting away from the more binary notion or whatever, to, and I think this is, you might even call this like a more sort of postmodern understanding of things. The binary thinking, in the social sciences is fairly antiquated. I think that, and again, this is this sort of, I don't know if you want to call it, the spotty or the lumpy nature of culture. I think within our own culture, right, rural Texas still tends to think in binaries. There are, I think, places in the country, subcultures within our society, identities within our society that are more comfortable in thinking outside of binaries. Whether that's in sex and gender relations, or race and ethnic relations, or other kinds of relations. A way to sort of think in those terms is to think about identity as interactive. And I think this is, there's definitely a political side to Schilt Westbrook, and really I think to all of the writing in gender and society. I was thinking about some of this, the ecofeminism. Ecofeminism, was that right? The stuff that Mary was. There's a political angle to it. That's a sort of an aspirational thing of this should be how the world is. But to some extent, it's also this is how the world is. So this idea of identity as an interactive accomplishment, I think we all face it to some extent. This is, essentially fake it till you make it. Act in a certain way, and that is what identity is. So if you want to be a man or a woman, you know, specifically in the context of this article, just act that way. And eventually you will accomplish what it is that you have set out to do. That's, clear in this case, obviously difficult though, because it does, as the authors point out, it does run into eventually that perception that there are certain kinds of identities that are not available to people because of bodily things. But more generally, and again, we could even sort of take this back to the habitus stuff. Like, if you want to be a racist, just act like a racist, and eventually you'll be a racist. You want to be an anti-racist, don't call people names and don't get angry at people for the kinds of ethnicities that they possess. You want to take on any identity in society, you do it by the kinds of interactions that you have here. And I think that pretty much wraps up the broader questions that I wanted to carry us to. Do you guys have any further questions on the day? Pretty well set. Okay, let me take a look at my big book here for a second. So we just finished doing gender. Okay, so then Monday, more on identity, and now, so identity construction and social structure amongst urban New Indians. So looking at Native Americans on Monday. Yes, that's right. Okay. So if that reading should be up. If it's not up, it will be up very soon. Otherwise, and at the end, so Andrea's supposed to present, but I'll probably end up presenting. I think he's having issues with travel in Italy. So otherwise, enjoy your weekends. You have books to read, I hope, for the book review. You brought those with you? Yeah, okay. All right, because that's due at some point in the next few weeks, right? So don't forget to be working on those.